So what can the Tories announce over the next 3 days to boost support in the polls? The pollster and director of JLL Partners, Scarlett Maguire, joins me here in Manchester. Scarlett, I've been around so long. I remember the 1986 Tory conference. Mrs Thatcher went into that conference way behind in the polls. She came out of it way ahead and went on to win a landslide. The Tories, here we are now, way behind in the polls, although there has been a contraction. What can they do this week to show that the Tories should win, that the voters should trust them to deliver a fifth historic general election victory?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think you've just said part of the problem, which is that they've got a bit more of an uphill struggle on their hands than even then in 86, because they're coming for an historic fifth election. Not only are they asking for the public to elect them for a fifth time, but they're asking the public to elect them again off the back of a few years of baggage and chaos. Now, some of that has been outside the government's hands, like, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, but the sort of levels of conservative psychodrama that we've seen here and in other conference venues over the years has not helped their current situation. So they've got a very big mountain to climb going into the next election. I do think there is room for the polls to narrow. We're seeing a little bit of that this week. We'll see whether that's going to be maintained over the next few weeks. And I think that is, broadly speaking, about two things. I think the first thing they'll need to do is to exploit the public's current concerns about the Labour Party. So at the moment, the public, you see this in focus groups, I think you also see this a bit in the polls, they want a change, they want to get rid of this government, but they are really, really, really unsure about Keir Starmer. They're unsure that he's not saying what he's going to do. They think he might be a little bit duplicitous, perhaps a little bit like other politicians in that slight dishonesty, at least by omission. And so there's some distinct weakness there. People are not being won over to him en masse. And then, more importantly, what they have to do is they have to persuade a few more of those people, a lot more of those people, who voted for them in 2019 to vote for them again, because at the moment they're haemorrhaging them, and that's what's causing them the most damage.
Interesting, there was a poll today of Conservative voters by another, which said that Boris Johnson, amongst Conservative voters, is by a long mile the most popular Prime Minister we've had. Now, Boris's great trick in 2019 was to project himself as a new leader. They'd been in power already for 9 years. He'd been Foreign Secretary for a few years of that. Can Rishi pull off that trick to show that he's in fact new and a fresh face?
Well, again, it's much harder with two Prime Ministers later, again, of the same Conservative government, which makes it's harder each time, I think, for that to happen. I also think that there are lots of problems, especially now with Boris Johnson electorally, but there is no doubt that he had something with the public, that he was very gifted at talking to people, at campaigning. We've not seen that yet from Rishi Sunak. I mean, he was phenomenally popular during the pandemic. I think what he'll need to do on Wednesday, it's more in his announcements than his tone, but both will be important. He's going to really need to cut through. He's going to have to do some striking things to try and make some headlines into things that people, the public, sitting at home will think, hang on, that's going to help me. I'm seeing this man in a different light than I did, a month ago, 2 months ago. And that's going to be difficult, but it's something that, he could do.
Yeah, we've got things like war on motorists. Well, that's great to a point, but that's hardly a great narrative, is it, to take into the next general election? Vote for us because we're on the side of motorists. He's going to talk about cutting inflation. Well, he's making progress on that. Huge problem still with stopping the boats across the channel. Does he have to come out with a real show-stopping new idea that we haven't seen yet?
I would think that we'll need something. We'll need something at least so that it can get into news bulletins and TV programmes and be talked about by people like you. We're going to need something that people at home can see. I also think that part of the thing about the war on motorists and some of the other policies will be trying to build an image of him as someone who is on the side of ordinary people, especially if he can position himself as on the side of ordinary people against difficult local authorities, potentially Labour local authorities that might be introducing measures that people feel to be punitive, like they do, like some people feel with motorists, for example, in Wales. But I think it will be trying to piece together that sense that this is a man that is on their side. However, again, we know that Rishi Sunak starts at a slight deficit from this because of who he's married to, because of some of his background. People don't assume he is on their side.
Because I've increasingly hear and have conversations with Labour saying, well, how can he possibly be in touch in a cost of living crisis? He's a billionaire. He's married to the daughter of a billionaire, but that's a narrative that Labour are going to keep pushing. It may not be terribly fair because we've had rich Prime prime ministers before, but none is quite as rich as this one.
So I think it may not be fair, but it's certainly effective, and it cuts through in focus groups. If you ask people, you see this in sort of word clouds. When you ask for one-word descriptions, you hear it in focus groups. When you ask people what they think about Rishi Sunak, they're not vitriolic. They don't, really dislike him, but they do think he is rich and out of touch. He's going to have to do a lot of work to try and overturn that. It's not impossible. The public don't necessarily mind a rich or potentially privileged prime minister. We've had Boris Johnson, we've had David Cameron.
Yeah.
But you're going to need to do something to communicate that you understand the problems that people are going through and are trying to do something about it.
I saw him last night very briefly, the Prime Minister. We had a little chat and he was in very good form. And one of his people said to me, what does he have to do? I said, look, he's the son of a GP and his mum set up her own little pharmacy business, which is still going strong in Southampton. Why don't you make more of that? And he said, we try to.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've heard, I hear that Keir Starmer's even going to make a joke that we've heard too much about his parents and their background at his next speech. But yeah, I think making more of a sense of his NHS, his more normal background and the life he might have then subsequently led, from university and who he's married to, would definitely be a strong point.
Just very briefly, in a few seconds, Scarlett, what's your hunch? You've been doing this a long time. You understand, can they possibly pull it off?
I think it is a huge uphill struggle.
Mount Everest?
Potentially.
Yeah, Mount Everest. And has he got the right climbing equipment? I'm not sure. That is Scarlett Maguire, who is a partner from JL Partners. Thanks very much. I'm going to go back to